All right. Our last speaker today is Todd Vare, Barnes and Thornburg. Todd is a known entity to the county commissioners, having spoken at various other county commissioner events across Indiana. Todd, we welcome you and look forward to your presentation.
So, thank you, and appreciate everyone's time this morning. We've talked a lot about I think the social engineering aspect, and I wanted to, when a law firm talks, you're always thinking, why is a law firm involved? I don't like lawyers involved. This scares me a little bit. One of the things that we do in our data security and privacy practice group is we come in and react to data security incidents, data breaches, and the like. I will tell you, we also do a lot of proactive work, proactive counseling, proactive policies and procedures development, proactive education and training. And the proactive part of our practice group is much, much, much less expensive than the incident response, the reactive side of things. So I think that what we're hearing today is extraordinarily important to try to become more proactive in our data security efforts, our data security policies and procedures that we all put into place. So social engineering, which was a big topic of Tim's discussion, as well as underlying all the discussions today, why does that matter? And why does it matter from your legal obligations or legal risks? Well, if you think about social engineering, what that really means to a lawyer, and not just a lawyer who might represent you, but lawyers who might sue you, or lawyers in other governmental entities who might impose fines on you, social engineering can be equated to negligence if you don't address social engineering appropriately. The failure to update applications when updates are available, that is negligence. The failure to educate and train your employees with adequate policies and procedures, that failure is negligence. The failure to apply and maintain restricted access to personal information, it's not a technical problem, it's a negligence problem. The failure to have or enforce policies and procedures relating to data security, network access, email use, internet use, mobile device use. The failure to do that is negligence. So these are all people-related issues. And I use the term that Tim just did, and that is buy-in. The failure to buy into your data security needs and the data security risks, that's a people issue. And so that's really kind of boils down to what your legal liability risk is, and that is avoiding negligence, avoiding reckless behavior in view of all of the data security, cybersecurity threats that are approaching local government today. So I wanted to give a bit of a perspective on how this threat applies to local governments. And I think the fact that I've spoken several times to county commissioners, county governments, local governments, city, state governments, I think local governments are starting to see the picture and see the threat, but they're still playing catch up. But if you think about what is the threat, county governments keep a lot of data. I mean, we had a question early on in this presentation about all the types of data. These are all the public records, the police protection, the education and welfare, voting and election services. Local governments like counties host and transfer vast amounts of personal information, or PI. These can include birth certificates, financial data, title information. And there is an increasing demand for this all to be done digitally. So what happens? This is a treasure trove for cyber criminals. They get in there and they find just a pot of gold awaiting for them, all of this personal information. So when you think about who are the targets within local government, well, payroll and human resources, transportation, utilities, emergency services, education, healthcare, election security. And there are many more. In pretty much every aspect of local government is a target for cyber criminals anymore. And the cost, there was I think a poll earlier, but the average cost of a data breach has risen from about $3.5 million in 2006 to over $8 million in 2019. There are an increasing number of ransomware attacks against state and local government networks. And a good example is the one that was a year or two ago on Baltimore. It cost the city of Baltimore $10 million in upgrades and $8.2 million in lost revenue. There have been more frequent ransomware attacks within the state of Indiana on counties and on cities, towns, municipalities, and even on the state of Indiana and agencies. These attacks are not just kids sitting in their basement just plain hacking. These are, in many respects, state-sponsored, mafia-sponsored, criminal enterprise-sponsored attacks. Because, again, there's a treasure trove of information. They get this information and they can use it themselves in their own criminal enterprise, or they can sell it. And a lot of times this information is just the platform for further criminal activity, cyber criminal activity, to get additional information. So this threat perspective graph shows the top 3 things that local governments need to ensure the highest level of cybersecurity. So this was the source of this poll was the International City and County Management Association. So pretty relevant to everybody here. The top 3 things that local governments need most to ensure the highest level of cybersecurity. And obviously, the first one is not surprising at all. 44% felt greater funding for cybersecurity was needed. And that is absolutely true. But we all understand that money is sometimes a tough commodity to come by. If we had all the money we could to throw at something like this, it would be great, but we don't. The next 2 points were 38% cited a need for better cybersecurity policies, and 38% cited a need for greater cybersecurity awareness among local government employees. So I'm going to talk really mostly about the second 2 bullet points because I can't help you with the funding. But it's important to know that it has to be a funding priority within local government, as is with any government or any company anymore. Let's go to the next slide. To give you a sense of why this is important to county governments and municipalities and cities and the like, there are definite legal obligations. The government entities on both the state and local level have to comply with a bunch of laws and other restrictions when collecting, storing, using, disclosing PI, personal information. There's an Indiana code that applies to state government, and there's an Indiana code that applies to persons, and persons have been defined to include local governments, including county governments. So that Indiana code is 24-4.9 and everything in there. So let's go to the next slide. So why we know this, and this, it's been a little confusing in Indiana. There was actually a question that was presented to the Indiana State Attorney General as to what a municipality should follow in terms of data breach requirements. And the Attorney General concluded that it is Indiana Code 24-4.9, which sweeps widely enough to encompass the duties of municipalities and others in making notifications and containing the damages caused by data breaches. So that is the statutory provision that applies to data breaches, data security incidents that might be suffered by a county government. So let's go to the next slide. I want to give you a bit of a sense of what this entails from a legal liability perspective. So first, what does it mean to be a breach of the security of a system? The breach means any unauthorized acquisition of computerized data that compromises the security, confidentiality, or integrity of personal information. And it's pretty straightforward in some respects. And if somebody breaches your data security system and acquires data and uses it, then that's going to be a breach of the security of your system. However, the breach can also include, for example, if somebody emails a document out that contains personal information, or if there's a ransomware attack that somehow shuts down or locks down your data, even if the data is never accessed or downloaded or sent out or acquired some way, that data has been compromised. So think about it, in a ransomware, they lock down and encrypt your data. You cannot access it unless you pay the ransom, usually in Bitcoin. Even if the ransomware attacker has not downloaded anything, and even if the ransomware attacker has not looked at your files, the data on your network has now been compromised, and you are required to identify whether or not there was personal information there, and if so, that compromised personal information, you must give a data breach notification under Indiana law. Let's go to the next slide. Personal information, what does that mean? It's a social security number that's not encrypted or redacted. So think about it's your full social security number, along with a name, or first name, first initial, last name, or one of the following other elements: driver's license, state ID, credit card, financial account number, debit card. So that defines what personal information is. Just simply a name and an address is not going to be personal information as of today. And I say as of today because the laws are continuing to change to become more restrictive. In California and Colorado and many other states, Illinois, the laws have become such that it's not just what you think of, social security number or a credit card number, and that's the only thing I have to worry about. The laws are becoming more and more restrictive, so you need to stay up to speed on what you need to protect. Let's go to the next slide. So what happens if you have a data security breach and it included personal information? The database owner must disclose that breach to Indiana residents that were affected by the breach. And if large enough, 1,000 residents, you have to disclose it to the consumer reporting agencies, and you also have to disclose it to the state attorney general. So those are your data breach notification obligations if personal information has been compromised as a result of a breach of your security system. Let's go to the next slide. The risks associated with the data breach or a data security incident could be criminal and civil investigations, could be sanctions or fines, especially if it involves information that is governed by a federal law, a federal statute. It can include private lawsuits, including class actions. There was a class action lawsuit filed against a Minnesota county in which the county had ultimately settled for $1 million associated with a data breach. You were required to disclose cybersecurity risks or incidents in bond offering documents, and you lose the public trust. So let's go to the next slide. So all of that, of what I just talked about, that is, if a data security breach occurs, these are the risks you incur, this is what you have to do, these are your notification obligations. And I now want to turn to preventing that, because there's two important things there. It is really difficult to manage a data security incident. So what do? you have to manage the risk of that up front. You have to do it proactively. You have to plan for the best efforts and put into place the best efforts to avoid a data breach. But you also have to plan for a data breach occurring. You have to put in place a policy and procedure, an incident response plan, for example, that will guide you. So if a data breach occurs, you're not scurrying around trying to figure out what to do, calling your local, the county lawyer who probably doesn't and is not a cybersecurity expert, trying to figure out what to do, calling the FBI, calling local police, calling the state agencies. At that point in time, it is really, really difficult to effectively process a data security incident if you don't have a plan in place. So it is so important, very important, to manage your risk up front. And so we've talked about today, I know Jason and Tim have both talked about a cybersecurity assessment, what goes into that. That is critical. We've talked about cybersecurity plans and policies, putting together a password management policy, putting together multi-factor authentication. These are policies that you need to put into a document and then implement and then govern and maintain and update on a continuous basis. Minimize, redact, or encrypt use of personal information. So instead, think to yourself, well, I'm going to take Social Security numbers, and I need driver's license numbers, and I need some financial information, but what can I do with that? Do I need the full Social Security number all the time? Or can I do something to redact it, make it just the last 4 digits, or minimize my use of it, or minimize the access to it, minimize the number of people who have access to this type of information? You need to stay current with software application updates. You need to do education and training. You need to have your data backup, and you need to manage your vendors. The last one is something that is often forgotten about. You can put together all your policies and procedures to address all of these things that we were talking about today. But then when you outsource payroll, for example, or you outsource some aspect of your county governance to a third party, you're going to enter into a contract. You need to understand what the contract says, if anything, about data security. Is it all on you? So if you're sending out data, personal information data, to a third-party vendor, and there's a breach at the third-party vendor, who is responsible? Well, under Indiana law, you're still the database owner, so you're responsible. But it may be something out of your control. So you need to make sure that in your vendor contracts, you have put into place controls and restrictions and requirements as it relates to the data that you're going to be sending that third-party vendor. For example, you want to consider indemnification. You want them to indemnify you and work with you if there is a data security. You want them to have their own data security policy and procedures in place. The last bullet on here is cyber insurance. You need to have cyber insurance for your own governance, but you also need to make sure your vendors have cyber insurance. That they're not going to say, well, sorry, we had a data breach and we were negligent, but we're just a small little vendor and we can't help you. So vendor management is very, very critical to understanding the data security umbrella that you need to put into place. The second to last bullet point there on managing risk is the incident response plan. And that is a document that you put into place that presumes there's going to be a data security incident. Why? Because you've heard over and over, it's not if, it's when. If there's a data security incident, this is what you will do. It's a flow chart. And many of the incident response plans I put together is not only the policies and procedures behind incident response, but it includes a very clear to follow flow chart of what happens. Who do you contact? How do you contact them? It has names and addresses and emails and cell phone numbers of who you need to contact and who you need to get involved to respond to an incident. So that if it unfortunately does happen, you know exactly what to do. You know exactly the processes that you need to follow. You know exactly who needs to be involved, who needs to be in the room, who needs to be doing what to respond to that incident. Go to the next page. So I have included in the materials, I think, that were circulated, some example plans that one was for the city of Shoreline, the other one was for Pierce County. These are just example plans that were accessible on the internet. The important thing, however, is that this just gives you an example of what other local governments are doing. The important thing is there's no one-size-fits-all. Nobody can write an incident response plan that would apply to every single county in Indiana, and you should not. There's a basic template of some things that you need to consider, but each county needs to address its own data security needs, because each county is going to have different levels, different amounts of volumes of personal information that they're going to intake and manage and use and maintain. They're going to have, each county is going to have different third-party vendors that they use to help them manage personal information or conduct county government business. Each county is going to have a different number of citizens that reside in that county. So each county needs to have its own separate incident response plan. Each county is going to have a different number of employees and a different number of employees who have access to personal information as part of their job. Each county is going to have different use of mobile devices. So each county should think about, I need to put together an incident response plan for my county. And that starts with your cybersecurity assessment that we talked about at the outset of this presentation. Through there, you start to understand what data you collect. You understand whether that data falls within the concept of personal information. You understand who has access to that data. You identify how they have access to that data. You understand and identify, is there restrictions on that access? Do they have access only internally on the network system, in the office, so to speak? Or can they access it from home on a laptop, or on the road from a mobile phone, or an iPad, or something like that? Through that process, you basically identify, it's almost like I hate to use the word audit, but it is somewhat of an audit. It's auditing your data security position, what you have, how you use it, where you use it, who has access to it. From there, you can make the assessment of, here's my PI, here's how I'm going to protect it, here's how I'm going to manage access to that PI, here's how I'm going to educate and train employees on that, and ultimately, here's my incident response plan if that PI is somehow compromised. So it is not, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. You really need to look at it and understand what needs you have and how to address them. The proactive side of this, which I just talked about, what Jason and Tim talked about, is it strikes everybody, even big companies, as something that is ominous and just too much to take on. But it is, once you get into it and once you go through this process, you will find that it is not only helpful to understanding how you manage your data, but helpful to understanding how you can better manage the data. It is, as I pointed out at the outset of my presentation, it is going to be a lot less expensive than trying to manage the incident that happens and the response to that incident. Company after company, local government, state agencies, every time I come in and I'm called in to manage the incident response, and I quarterback the incident response, it is always more expensive than if I had estimated and said, here's what I would charge you, or here's what a third-party IT vendor, security vendor might charge you. The proactive side of this is going to be always less expensive than the reactive side of this. Let's go to the final slide. So we've been talking about the money, how to minimize the reactive side of this, how to minimize the risk, and particularly the monetary risk of the reactive side of this. Insurance is one way, and it's a very important way. And I've included in the presentation materials a document that is titled Insurance Coverage for Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Risks. Getting cyber insurance is the same thing as getting homeowners insurance or business interruption insurance or insurance that protects, county infrastructure, county buildings, county cars, and vehicles. It's the same thing. Those are all assets and needs that a county has. Well, so is collection of data, so is maintaining data. And you need to get cyber insurance to cover the risk of having that data compromised. And so a typical cyber insurance policy would come in and cover the reaction to that data security incident, to the data breach. It would cover things like lawyers and IT, third-party forensics to come in. It would cover the cost of that, the expense of that, the data breach notification expenses. It would cover all of that. So one aspect of minimizing your risk on the reactive side is insurance. Another aspect would be in the vendor management, which I talked about earlier, is transfer the risk. Understanding that ultimately the buck stops at you. The buck stops at the county as the database owner under the law. Even if you're sending out data to somebody else to manage for payroll, for example, and it's the payroll vendor that gets breached, it's still your data. It's still the data of your employee. So at the end of the day, minimizing risk through cyber insurance, minimizing your risk through indemnification policies and procedures can help allay the cost on the reaction side. So that's really all I've got. It's hard to think about a data breach and what it really entails unless you've gone through it. And I think what we're trying to do, all of us are trying to do here, is to avoid you going through it, is to put into place the policies and procedures that help you to avoid going through a data security incident. But if that happens, understanding how to react quickly and properly, and with the right people involved, and understanding the right things to say and do and not to say and do. There was a comment early on today. Sometimes you get out in front of it. It's like getting on top of your skis, out in front of your skis, and you start flipping over down the mountain. You can sometimes get out in front of a data security incident and say too much right at the outset, and it's wrong, and it's not accurate, and that's going to come out later. And so being inaccurate but quick is just as bad as being accurate but too late. So there's a process that you have to go through, and that all goes into the incident response plan. So I'm happy to answer any questions. My email is on the front of my presentation. If you wanted to email me, follow up with anything, I'm happy to answer any questions about what it's going to take, what you need to do, as well as put you in touch with folks like Jason and Tim and others.
Todd, we've got one question out there. It says, some federal ransomware guidelines note that if an organization can prove data was never exfiltrated, the organization doesn't have to report it as a breach. Indiana law doesn't seem to account for that. Am I interpreting that law correctly?
I actually don't think so. And I think that I'm not sure that there is, it depends upon what federal ransomware guidance is being referenced, because there really is no federal law on a lot of these things. It's mostly state law. But in a ransomware event, the mere fact that somebody comes in as a cyber attacker and takes your data, your network security, and locks it down, almost every state law is going to say that is compromised data. So if you come in, you have data on your network that otherwise qualifies as protectable personal information, and the ransomware attacker locks it down, by definition, that is compromised personal information. Now, if the network that gets locked down does not contain personal information, then, and you can prove that, then you may not have to do a data breach notification. So it all comes down to, is there acquisition, exfiltration, or compromise of the personal information? The data does not need to be exfiltrated to constitute a data breach under Indiana law and pretty much every other state law.
Todd, what do you think the state of Indiana is relative to counties percentage-wise to have an adequate incident response plan?
In other words, where would I put them? It's hard to say. I did give a presentation last fall to county lawyers. I think it was in early November. And I asked by the raise of hands how many had an incident response plan in place. And in the room of about, and I can't tell you it was all that every representative, it probably wasn't every representative of every county, but in a room of about 80 attendees, there were 2 that raised their hand.
Wow.
And this is not to kind of disparage county lawyers or county government in terms of their incident response preparedness. I could put the same number of small to medium-sized companies in the room and ask them, do you have an incident response plan in place? And either they would not know or they would not have one.
Right. That's sobering.
Think about, when you think about the signs that are in your buildings about what you do if there's a fire or tornado. And there are signs posted and you have drills, and drills are mandated and required. I mean, you have to understand, where do you go to exit the building if there's a fire? Right. Who's responsible on each floor to make sure everybody's out of their office and exited the building? And not just, you don't just put it up on the wall and forget about it. You put it up on the wall and then you have subsequent drills. You go through to make sure that it works. It's the same thing with, that's really what an incident response plan is. It's a plan that if there's a fire that affects your data, a cyber attacker attacks your data, then it's a plan for how to resolve it, how to respond to it, who should be involved, who's responsible for this process, who's responsible for that, who needs to get notified, how law enforcement gets involved, how public relations gets involved, how lawyers get involved. That's really all it boils down to.